How often have we said, British Muslims are, then you can fill in your own word. The reality is that anything that you try to say about all British Muslims will be false as soon as you go beyond the most basic, that all British Muslims believe that the Quran is the word of God. Because there are some basic things that define a Muslim, but once you go beyond that, Muslims in Britain are extremely diverse, and that's what I want to talk about. I'm a retired tax advisor, and I studied mathematics at university. I have many other qualifications which were on the front page, but none of them have anything to do with religion. I have absolutely no formal religious training. So what qualifies me to talk about matters of religion? Only that I've been interested in the subject all my life. I've actually read the Bible from cover to cover, including all of the boring pieces, as well as obviously reading the Quran and other things like the Bhagavad Gita. I'm now retired. The most important thing about retirement is that you have to have something that motivates you and excites you, and I care passionately about Britain and British society, which is why I'm active with the Conservative Party, with the Muslim Jewish Forum of Greater Manchester, and with lots of other organisations as well. And there's far more about me on my website. The other thing that's on my website are hundreds of pages about politics, religion, finance, etc. And if the recording works, this talk will be on the website as well. What am I going to talk about? I've got a little test. I was a teacher for 1 year, so that never goes out of your system. And then I want to talk about what Muslims are physically, the demographic diversity, because it's so easy to assume that all Muslims in the UK are like the Muslims that we see sitting in this room. They're actually much more diverse than that. I then want to talk about the other aspect of diversity, nothing to do with ethnic diversity, beliefs. Beyond believing in the basics of Islam, you will find an enormous range of different beliefs and different views amongst Muslims. And I want to talk about a little bit of that in the time that I've got. And then finally, I have 2 short messages for Christians and Muslims, and then we'll go over to questions and answers. So, can you pick out the Muslims? I'll give you one easy answer now, that one. Any other offers?
Number 3 on the top row.
Number 3 looks pretty plausible. Dressed the right way.
All of them.
All of them? Yes. You got it. All of them. Some extremely interesting people in that list. Some of them were born into families where their parents were Muslims. Quite a lot of them were not, including him. So the slides I will also make available to you. I mean, they'll go onto the internet as well, but you can have them via the administrator as well. I'll email them to her afterwards, because the slides tell you who they are. And this chap, for example, is a pal of mine. He was head boy at Eton. His great-grandfather led the British fleet at the Battle of Jutland, Lord Jellicoe. He's Muslim. Christian Bakker used to present on MTV. And the guy with the Arab headdress was born as a Polish Jew, Mohammed Amin. And he provided a really good translation of the Quran, one of my favorites, and he wrote an extremely moving book called The Road to Mecca. Muslims are a religious group, they're not an ethnic group. You can't tell if somebody's a Muslim by looking at them. So a look at the demographics of British Muslims. When I say there have always been some Muslims in this country, certainly that is true for hundreds and hundreds of years, even if not very many. There was a small Yemeni community in Wales, another small Yemeni community in Teesside, dating back, I think, to the 1800s. The first major wave of Muslim immigration started in the 1950s. And I'm not going to claim that I started it, but having been here in 1952, I don't go around challenging people, but it's actually very hard to find a Muslim who's been in this country longer than I have. People could only guess at the numbers of British Muslims until the 2001 census. That was the first time that the government included an optional question in the census where you could say what religion you were. The Muslim Council of Britain had pressed for that very hard for several years and got it. And the 2001 census found that there were 1.6 million people in this country who ticked the box to say that they were Muslims. That's for Great Britain. In 2011, the number that I've got is for England and Wales, because Scotland has its own census, has its own separate website, and I just can't be bothered with it. But in England and Wales, 2.7 million people, almost twice the numbers. And the mix is changing. The other point about the census, before we look at the numbers, is the categories used on the census are a little bit arbitrary. They tried to cover the main categories of Muslims, but they missed or failed to separately classify some groups that I would regard as quite important. Both in 2001 and 2011, there is no category for Turks. Turks are classified, well, you can decide where you want to classify yourself but on the census, but in general I think Turks fall under the category of white other. In 2001 there was no category for Arabs, and I think Arabs in 2001 probably fell under white other, might have fallen into any other ethnic category, but in 2011 there was a category for Muslims, for Arabs. But since there wasn't in 2001, when comparing the two, I just treated Arabs in 2011 as other ethnicity. So let's look at the results. And they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but I think this is the picture that proves that's not true. This shows the categories in 2001 adding up to 100%, and the categories in 2011. And if you're really good at colour spotting, you can see how the shape of that compares with the shape of that, and look down there to see the numbers. But frankly, I actually don't find this chart particularly helpful. And as I said, having created it, I decided to keep it just to prove that charts aren't always a good idea. And I'd much rather look at the numbers. Bear in mind, again, these are percentages. So just because that category 4.1% went to 2.9% doesn't mean that there were less of them. 2011, we're looking at numbers that are almost twice as big in absolute terms as 2001. So white British, the absolute numbers would have gone up, but interestingly enough, as a percentage of all Muslims, they've fallen, even though conversions happen all the time. And there are now probably about 100,000 at least converts who are white British to Islam. The white other category, as I said, I think Turks fall into that, although I can't be certain because it's a question of how people choose to classify themselves. The most important trend, as far as I'm concerned, is that these three categories, Indian, Pakistani and Bangladeshi, are shrinking as a percentage of the total, although they still are more than half. So more than half of British Muslims still originated, or their parents originated, from the Indian subcontinent. Black African, very significant growth. From 6.1 to 7.7, and of course that's 7.7% of a much larger population. Caribbean, again, remarkable growth. And the other ethnicity, I think, is primarily down to the growth of Arabs in this country, where the population has increased very significantly. So British Muslims are extremely varied. And gradually they're starting to look more and more like Muslims in the world, as Britain itself keeps changing. The next area of diversity I want to look at now is to move away from people's ethnicity to look at what people believe. There is very, very significant theological diversity amongst British Muslims. This is what my father taught me. Christians are incredibly divided, but we Muslims all believe the same thing. My father was not an educated man, but I think even my father knew better than that. But I was quite young at the time, and you don't want to confuse young children or lead them astray. And it's a political message that we get all the time. Everybody talks about Muslim unity. The reality is that Muslim unity is a fiction. Once you get beyond the basics, Muslims have very significant disagreements. And the reality is that Islam has had division from the very earliest days, just as Christianity did. And when I was composing this talk, I started thinking about divisions in Christianity and how early you could trace them back. And you can trace them right back to the New Testament, because there were very significant disagreements about religious matters between Paul of Tarsus, St. Paul, and James, and the original disciples of Jesus. And as time passed, there was a group of Christians who were often described as Jewish Christians, who still adhered to Jewish religious laws, and other Christians who didn't. This is long before the divisions that you get later on about Arianism, etc. I'm not going to go into a long history of Christian theology, but Christianity in reality has been divided from the very beginning. Never mind the Reformation, I'm talking about the first century. And the reality is that the same is true of Muslims. While the Prophet, peace be upon him, was alive, Muslims were completely united, because they had a leader who had direct communications from God. After he died, some level of division set in straight away. Since the invasion of Iraq, people have become very familiar in this country with the Sunni-Shia divide. Even people who have no interest in religion, no interest in Islam, they see it in the news. The key question, right at the very beginning of Islam, after the Prophet, peace be upon him, died, is who should take charge? And there were two alternative views. One group of people felt that the person to lead them should be the Prophet's closest male relative. Gender equality didn't exist in those days. The other group felt that you should choose the best person from the Prophet's close companions, the people who knew him best, irrespective of whether they were directly related to the Prophet or not. That group was the majority, and therefore the next leader, Abu Bakr, was the Prophet's closest companion, not Ali. The minority, the people who supported Ali, they are now known as the Shia. The word Shia is simply Arabic for the party or the grouping, for Ali. And that divide in Islam has been there ever since. Worldwide, Shia Muslims are probably about 10% of the total population worldwide, although in some countries, of course, they're much larger. Iran is the most famous Shia dominated country, although if you study the history of Iran, it's only been predominantly Shia for about 400 years. It was a political decision to promote the Shia brand of Islam in Iran about 1600 AD under Shah Abbas. Before that, Iran was primarily Sunni. The schools of Islamic law. The most famous surviving Sunni schools of Islamic law, 4 of them, are named after their founders: Abu Hanifa, Malik, Shafi, and Ibn Hanbal. They agree about an enormous number of things because they are Sunni schools after all, but they also disagree about many matters of interpretation. I'll give you a nice simple concrete one. If you're a Muslim and you're married and you want to take a second wife, do you need your first wife's permission? 3 of the 4 of these schools say, no, you don't need her permission. The other one says, yes, you do need her permission. I can't remember which way around it is. But that's just one simple illustration. There are many other issues about jurisprudence that you could ask about these schools and you would get different answers. Geographically, the coverage of these schools where they predominate is quite different. But that geography isn't sort of cast iron, in the sense that obviously in North Africa you could find Hanbali scholars as well, but predominantly North Africa has tended to be Maliki. And then let's move into more recent history and how you respond to the modern world. And my starting example, Japan, has got nothing to do with Islam at all. I just picked it because it was an interesting illustration of how countries do or don't choose to react. The history here is that Japan, about 1600 something, decided to cut itself off from the rest of the world. Before that, they had trading relationships. Dutch seamen used to go there, etc. But Japan closed its borders, and they did an equivalent of sort of Brexit, but from the whole world. They wanted nothing to do with the outside world. And they managed like that for several hundred years, until in 1868, when, from memory, it was Admiral Perry, an American, turned up with 3 modern American ships just visiting Japan. And the Japanese were shocked to realize how far ahead of themselves the Americans, and therefore the rest of the world, was. And they overthrew the shogun, restored the rights of governorship of the Emperor Meiji, and set out to change their society from top to bottom to catch up. And they sent people to the UK, for example, to study at University College London. They set out to transform their society, and they did it so successfully that from 1868, by 1905, they defeated Russia on land and on sea in modern warfare. And I often think about Japan when I think about Ottoman Turkey, because Ottoman Turkey was right next door to Europe, had enormous amounts of intercommunication. And there's a book called, I think it's called What Went Wrong, by an American scholar whose name will come back to me because I wasn't thinking about it specifically in advance, showing how the Turks tried to study what Europe was doing and copy it, but they were never radical enough, which is why Ottoman Turkey continued to fall further and further behind, whereas the Japanese turned their society upside down. Moving away from Japan now, thinking about Muslims. In India by 1866, of course, was totally British controlled. The 1857 First War of Indian Independence, or Indian Mutiny, depending upon your politics, had taken place. And the Deoband religious seminary, Darul Uloom, was set up by a group of people who believed that the fundamental problem of Indian Muslims was that they were not good enough with their religion. They needed better religion. Conversely, 1875, Sir Syed Ahmad Khan founded what is now Aligarh Muslim University, because he believed that the problem of Indian Muslims was actually not insufficient religion, but insufficient secular education. They needed to know more maths and physics. And if you look at colonized Muslims in other parts of the world, you will find the same divergent approaches. Some Muslims, their reaction to being colonized is actually, it's happened to us because we were insufficiently religious. Others will say it's happened to us because our technology, our understanding of the modern world was not good enough. And I've got some concrete examples. Egypt, officially independent, but in practice, Britain used to have it as a sort of disguised colony. The British ambassador in Cairo was the guy who pulled all the strings, and the local government basically did what they were told. It was a puppet state. And in 1928, Hassan al-Banna, who was a school teacher, and very young at the time, he's aged in his 20s, founded the Muslim Brotherhood to refresh and revitalize Islam with the intention of transforming Egyptian people and Egyptian society to throw off the colonial shackles. It was a religious revival movement. And Hassan al-Banna himself, I don't think, was terrorist inclined, but the movement did eventually move into terrorism and is undoubtedly one of the intellectual antecedents of Al-Qaeda and indeed of ISIS, in my view. But let's move back to India. British ruled India. They concentrated on dividing Hindus and Muslims together, to magnifying religious hostility. And the most influential Muslim thinker in the modern world in India, I would say, is Maududi. Born in 1903, and in 1941 he founded the Jamaat-e-Islami, which is still in existence as a political party in India with offshoots in the UK. And to my mind, the most important thing about Maududi is to understand the environment, the intellectual environment that he grew up in. Because by the 1920s, he would be in his early 20s. And the most fashionable ideologies at that time were fascism and Bolshevism. And when you read what Maududi wrote, and I've read a couple of his books, to me it's quite clear that what Maududi created was basically a vision of a society more or less identical to fascism and Bolshevism, state-controlled, but wrapped in Islamic language. And I would classify him as the other intellectual antecedent of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, because both what Al-Qaeda and ISIS want to do is to restore a political system which is a Muslim political system. This one has no connection with colonialism at all, and I picked it for that reason, because not all religious movements are reactions against the outside world. That red bit of Saudi Arabia is the Najd. It's basically desert, and nobody wants it, which is why the Ottomans never bothered conquering it. The British, when they were influential, they controlled Yemen, Aden, they controlled the eastern coast indirectly, but nobody wanted the middle bit. And that middle bit is where Muhammad ibn Wahhab came from. And he was a religious thinker. He formed an alliance with the Saud family, even in a couple of hundred his time, late 1700s. And he preached a very extreme understanding of Islam, which held that Shia Muslims were not Muslims, and therefore they could be killed. And the Saudis, even in those days, used to have raiding parties to the east towards Iraq, where they would surround Shia villages and basically kill them. And his thinking is, at the moment, the official state religion in Saudi Arabia. And I want to recommend a book by Innes Bowen, who's a BBC journalist. She spent several years travelling around British Muslim communities, talking to them, getting to understand them. And it's a very nice, easy to read book about some of the diverse communities of British Muslims. Not all of them, because there are far too many to fit into one short book. You see that she'll talk about the Jamaat-e-Islami, the people who are great followers of Maududi, the Muslim Brotherhood, some of the Shia groups. The Ismailis are a very small group, about 30,000 in the UK, but very successful, very well organised. The Deobandis, I mentioned Deoband College before, strongly recommend it. And the other thing I want to mention, because it's happening next weekend, I've got no financial connection with either Innes Bowen or with this conference, but the conference is put on by somebody I know quite well, Dilwar Hussain. I'm attending the British Islam Conference this weekend. £39 for both days, or £25 for a day, in central London near Old Street Underground Station. And if you attend that conference, again, you'll see just how diverse British Muslims actually are, both ethnically, but more important, theologically. So moving on to my closing messages before the Q&A. I've got one message for Christians and one message for Muslims. For Christians, whenever you encounter anybody who says Islam says, challenge them, ask them for chapter and verse, and the reality is that unless it is the absolute fundamental basics of the religion, like the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, by the Archangel Gabriel, once you get beyond those basics, almost anything that somebody says Islam says will be disagreed with by other Muslims. That's the reality on the ground. That doesn't mean that all views about religion are equally valid, quite clearly. Some will be right and some will be wrong, and ultimately on the Day of Judgment God will decide. But the reality is that there is no uniform statement that you can make about what British Muslims believe or what Islam says. It's an extremely diverse, varied religion, and over the centuries Muslims have argued in great detail about every aspect of their religion, just as Christians have. It is a religion that is every bit as diverse as Christianity. And my message for Muslims: we're here at the Council for Christian-Muslim Relations, and Muslims are really keen on interfaith harmony. How much are we doing about intra-faith harmony? You will find people who will regularly meet with Christians, will go to churches, will go to synagogues, although I think in this area there may not be many synagogues, but they will never set foot inside a mosque that belongs to a different theological group. When I was growing up in Manchester in the early 1950s, there was only one mosque, the Manchester Central Mosque in Victoria Park. My father was one of the people who helped to get it started originally. Because there was only one mosque, everybody used to go there, regardless of their ethnic background, regardless of their theological, religious background. Then in the 1960s, because that wasn't big enough, we established a second mosque, and very quickly that became the Bangladeshi mosque. And then with the 1972 War of Independence, it definitely became the Bangladeshi mosque. And now, of course, Manchester is full of mosques. Mosques of different ethnic groups, mosques of different religious groups, and people have nothing to do with each other. They'll all happily engage in interfaith harmony and go and talk to Christians, but they won't talk to each other. And I would strongly encourage every Muslim in this room to take a serious interest in intra-faith harmony. It doesn't mean you have to agree with them. I'm a Sunni, categorically. I believe that Muslims made the right decision back at the time when they chose Abu Bakr. And because I'm a Sunni, it means, by definition, I'm not a Shia. I believe that Shias are wrong. Just because I believe that people are wrong does not stop me wanting to share food with them, going to their events, talking about issues where we have many things in common. You can believe that somebody is wrong. I believe every Christian in this room is completely wrong. Totally. That doesn't mean that I'm going to get into combat with Christians. And we should have the same issue with other Muslims that we have with Christians. And with that, let me throw it open to questions and answers.